Well, our first guest this evening is friend of the show, Steve Weidenkopf. He is an adjunct professor at the Christendom College Graduate School of Theology in Alexandria, Virginia. He's the author of Timeless, A History of the Catholic Church, and The Real Story of Catholic History, Answering 20 Centuries of Anti-Catholic Myths, and the Glory of the Crusades, and many more. He joins us this evening to discuss his newest book, The Church and the Middle Ages, Cathedrals, Crusades, and the Papacy in Exile. Welcome back to the Busted Halo Show, Steve Weidenkopf.
Thanks, Father. Thanks for having me on the show again. Appreciate it.
How are you?
I'm doing well.
I mean, how's your whole pandemic been?
Yeah, I can't say it's been too bad, frankly. My family's all healthy and well, and we have this great technology now, so we can teach with people all over the country. They don't even have to be in the classroom anymore.
Well, because you're an expert on history, and particularly the church history, and the Middle Ages, probably between that whole time span that we'll be talking about, I would imagine once or twice there was some plague or other, wasn't it? This would be common back then.
Yeah, there was one minor little plague called the Black Death, that happened in the 14th century. Just only wiped out half of Europe's population. Small plague.
Are you implying that during that people did not just work from home on Zoom? That was more.
Yeah, there was no lockdown orders or anything. Well, I guess there was actually in a certain sense. In some areas that were actually they kind of quarantined a bit. But it was quite the event in the life of Europe and the church as well, frankly.
So your latest book is called The Church and the Middle Ages. Now, I bet some folks might say, well, I guess that's roughly between 0 and 2000. Is that right? When we say Middle Ages, what do we mean?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's nice for historians to kind of take time periods and give them labels, right? It helps us to be able to teach in more digestible ways. But the term period, actually, Middle Ages, began as a pejorative term. It began as a way for people to describe, you had the ancient world, ancient Greek and Roman world, and that classical civilization. Then you had the Italian Renaissance in the late 14th century, 15th century, and then there was all these years kind of in between. And so when these German historians in the 19th century were trying to categorize some documents from that period of time, they didn't know what to call it. So they just said, well, we'll call it the middle period, right? Between this classical civilization and the rebirth of classical civilization. So you have anywhere from 500 to 1500, depending on different historians, will categorize it differently, almost 1,000 years that we just label with this term Middle Ages. And so I do a bit of introduction in the book to try to describe what do we mean by that and what is that term. And there's a lot of debate actually in the academic community about whether we should even use the term Middle Ages or medieval. And I take the tack that, properly used and properly defined, you should be able to use the term and kind of talk about it, though, in an authentic perspective, right? To make sure that people know there's a lot going on in the church's history during this time and good things.
Well, I wonder if the people that are on the side of not wanting to use it are perhaps themselves middle-aged and they don't like that term as the Middle Ages. You start to get that paunch,
You get the paunch, things start to hurt more when you exercise for longer periods of time.
Yeah, you wake up and it sounds like a popcorn machine in there,
Exactly. You have to make a noise when you sit down in your chair all the time.
But medieval sounds like you're middle evil too. So that wouldn't be very good either in that context.
No,
so,
that's right.
But for the purpose of your current book, The Church and the Middle Ages, roughly 1,000, the year 1000 to about, 1400? Maybe?
Yeah, I choose to end it at 1378.
Of course, 1378.
That was, I took a dartboard and I had my history darts and I threw it up against there and that's where I came up.
Come on. Something happened.
I decided to end the book with the papacy returning to Rome from their 70-year exile in the south of France in Avignon. And I thought that was a good place to end it. And then the next volume in the series can pick up the story from there.
Okay. Well, and we look forward to a next volume. But for now, let's rewind. If we're starting at the year 1000, I would bet there's at least a few people listening to us right now that would realize somewhere in those first couple of decades after we hit the year 1000 is maybe one of the first. Is it fair to say? Is it too much to say that was really one of the first times that Christianity was challenged with division?
Yeah, I would say that. I mean, that's definitely true. Halfway through that 11th century, right, you have what some people call the Great Schism, right, between Eastern and Western halves of the church. And, you know, there's a lot of debate even now about how important that event was, that it really ruptured the two halves. And regardless of the debate, it's definitely, consensus that there was ramifications of the event. You know, you had papal legates who went to Constantinople, who excommunicated the Patriarch of Constantinople. He was obviously upset with that. He excommunicated them. A lot of
give us a quick. When we say Eastern and Western half, we don't mean like California versus New York. What are we talking about when we say Eastern and Western?
No, yeah, that's a good point. What we mean by that is you know, you had the church going all the way back actually to the 4th century. Diocletian, the Roman emperor, divides the Roman Empire into two halves, Eastern and Western.
Oh, that was his idea.
That was his idea. It goes all the way back to him. Yeah. And actually, even further, he divided the empire into two halves, but then even divided it even into smaller regional jurisdictions, which shockingly he named after himself. He called them dioceses. So you have that's where we get that name.
Wait a minute.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Steve Weidenkopf, mind blowing. Because Diocletian, it's weird because he's so mean in many other ways.
Yeah, he instituted the Great Persecution, right, which killed.
Like when we do his character on Saints of Our Lives, it's our little fun soap opera that we do. Not nearly as historically accurate as what you would probably want. No. But Brett usually plays Emperor Diocletian.
I am Diocletian,
and we play the Darth Vader theme like behind him.
That's great. That's fantastic.
Yeah, he kind of comes off as an evil guy outside of the whole creating dioceses thing.
But that's what I mean, that we name every day when we wake up as a Catholic. Like, what diocese are you in? You mean the Diocletian divisions of our...
That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah, no,
it goes back to him. Steve.
Yeah, so how the church adopts that, right, is that over the centuries from Diocletian, you begin to have the post-Roman world, right after the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century. You have political power and authority in the West evolves down to local regional jurisdictions, usually centered on some military commander, Roman military commander, and the bishop of the church. And the church adopted this Roman organizational structure, and it continued that organizational structure even after the Roman Empire had collapsed in the West. So that's how you get the division between East and West. And so as that happens in the Western part of the church, where this whole new political structure develops from the 5th century on, in the Eastern half of the church, centered in Constantinople, where Constantine the emperor had moved the imperial capital back in the 4th century, today's
Istanbul, right?
Right, yes.
So people are thinking geographically, like Western Europe would be west, and then kind of align what we would call Eastern Europe, right?
Yeah, I mean, roughly the eastern half of the empire was there. It's more, east of Italy, and then into, Greece, and into Turkey, and then the Holy Land, that area of the empire.
So that's east and west.
That's east and west.
His idea.
Exactly. So in the eastern half of the empire, that continued, even though the Western imperial government collapsed in the 5th century. In the eastern part of the empire, it continued and progressed on. So that when you get to the 11th century, there's still an emperor, a Roman emperor in the east, in Constantinople. Whereas in the west, the main political actor, there are a multitude of different actors, different kings and dukes and whatnot, but you have the Pope, who really is the one kind of central political figure in the West. And so you have this issue that arises in this what's called the Great Schism, rather, between this division between East and West halves of the churches over some theological issues and some great misunderstandings, frankly. And it causes a bit of a rupture, which sadly still exists today.
Steve Weidenkopf is our guest here on the Busted Halo Show, and we're talking about his newest book, which is The Church and the Middle Ages, Cathedrals, Crusades, and the Papacy in Exile. I'm dying to know, now that you've already blown my mind about the Diocletian diocese, but I'm dying to know about who this guy is called Abbot Suger. He sounds like a man after my own heart. He was make some cupcakes or something. Abbot Suger.
Yeah, that's actually. Do you want to pronounce his name Suger?
Suger.
Oh. Yeah, Suger. You want to sound more cultured and more French.
Oh, thank you. It's actually better that way, so we don't distract our host.
Because otherwise, I'm thinking about sugar.
Donuts.
So who is Abbot Suger?
Yeah, so Abbot Suger is an interesting character. He's one of a multitude of different characters I highlight in the book that are alive during this period of time. And he is an abbot at the monastery of Saint Denis, which is it's about 45 minutes north of Paris.
Saint Denis, to anglicize it.
Saint Denis, yes, Saint Denis. We want to let's be cultured. So we can be French here for a bit. So he lives at the end of the 11th century and into the 12th century. And what he does that has a lasting impact on Christendom and the church and the world, frankly, is he develops a new architectural style of how to build cathedrals, how to build churches. Yeah, it's pretty impressive, this guy. And so he decides to build a new abbey church at Saint Denis, and he envelops, or he innovates certain architectural techniques. Like he expands the ceiling and puts vaulting architectural technique into the ceiling so it can be higher. He has great stained glass windows that he puts into the building in order to bring forth great light. There's a rose window in Saint Denis as well, and like we'll see in many other so-called Gothic cathedrals that follow him. So he's the one that really begins this innovation, this change in architecture, which leads to the great building of the cathedrals all throughout Western Europe.
Wow. So Abbot Suger.
Yes.
I prefer Sugar and Dennis.
Yeah, and Sugar Abbot is like some sort of like, monk that makes sugar like cookies or something. if you reverse his name around, so I'm glad.
It'd be like a Catholic substitute for stevia or something, right?
Right.
Abbot Sugar.
What color is that packet?
Sugar Abbot.
Yeah.
Maybe
Packet's all holy.
It's one of the liturgical colors. It's like green, maybe, for ordinary time.
There you go. That's good.
The Church and the Middle Ages, Cathedrals, Crusades, and the Papacy in Exile is the new book from Steve Weidenkopf. We've certainly got a link on our radio blog as to where you can pick that up from Ave Maria Press, I believe. And a friend of the show, the series editor, Mike Aquilina, right?
Absolutely. Yep.
So he calls you up and he goes, Steve, you know a few things about history. Throw a book together.
In essence, yeah. He came up with a whole different volumes. I think there's 7 in the series. Yeah. And he said, which one do you want? No, he said, hey, would you write the one on the Middle Ages?
You're like, I'll do Middle Ages.
I'll do Middle Ages. Yeah, that's the easier one to do. There's no misconceptions about that.
In the subtitle of the book, Cathedrals, so that's what we were just talking about. Now, in terms of Abbot Suger, is he what we would refer to as Gothic cathedrals? That's his idea, or they modified it a little bit?
Exactly. I mean, he begins the whole architectural style, which we commonly call Gothic style. There's some that would argue it shouldn't be called that because that, again, later is a pejorative term that's given by Italians to the architectural style. So others argue.
So how do they mean it? Why is that bad?
Gothic. They didn't. They thought it was more barbaric, magnificent, big, foreboding, impressive. These kinds of things.
It kind of probably turns on even today at your public high school. There would be kids that if they call themselves the goth kids, then that's okay. But if the jocks call them goth, then that's not okay.
That's not okay. Exactly. Right.
All right.
And they would be wearing dark clothing and things like that. Although the Gothic architecture was anything but that, right? It was very light and airy and uplifting.
Right. Yeah. Wow. Okay. I have to soak it in sometimes. Take all the history in when Steve's on the show. So probably most people have heard of, quote unquote, the Crusades, but maybe either they don't want to know because they probably think, ooh, that's when the church was bad and I don't really want to know how bad we were or whatever. But how would you define the Crusades? And does it refer to a period of time? Was there like 7 or 2 Crusades, or why is it in the plural usually?
Yeah, a great question. And the Crusades is one of the most misunderstood, right, and mischaracterized events all in church history. Yeah, thanks. That was a good question, Father. I mean, if you give a bad question, I'll let you know. Right?
Yes, please.
It's a bad question.
You just give me a buzz. Sometimes we do that on the show. Like, really? There you go.
Exactly. Right. That's right. No, the Crusades really, I refer to them, or I like to refer to them as the crusading movement, because that's really what this was. It was a movement that began in the 11th century, late 11th century in the church, and it continued on really all the way up until the 17th century. So we're talking multitude of centuries, hundreds of years. The church is engaged in this really fight, this armed pilgrimage. It initially begins as an armed pilgrimage to liberate ancient Christian territory, which had been occupied by Muslim forces in North Africa and in the Holy Land. And then it develops over time as the kind of front, if you will, of the war changes. As we get into the later centuries of the movement, it becomes more of a defense of the homeland campaigns, as the Ottoman Turks in particular invade Eastern Europe, even get all the way up to the gates of Vienna when we get to the 16th and 17th century. So it changes a bit.
So it wouldn't be accurate to say that this was just how we did evangelization back then. It began militarily, and the way in which church and state, let's say, were kind of more overlapping or intertwined back then. Even the Pope would say, hey, they're like the president or king of a country would say, they're invading our territory. We got to protect that kind of thing.
Exactly. But yeah, basically, that's exactly right. I mean, the impetus for it in the 11th century was you had a group of Muslims, the Seljuk Turks, who come down off the Central Asian steppe, and they invade the modern day area of Turkey, what was then called the Eastern Roman Empire province of Anatolia, which is again modern day Turkey, Asia Minor. So they come and they invade that, and they begin to put a lot of political and military pressure on the Eastern Empire. So the Eastern Emperor sends letters and ambassadors to the West, specifically to the Pope, and asks him to marshal some warriors and send them east in order to help protect his territory and regain the territory that had been conquered by the Muslims. So this, this whole campaign begins again as a defense of Christian territory, and in response to this Islamic invasion, as well as a response to Islamic activity, violent activity against Christian pilgrims and indigenous Christians who were living in the Holy Land at the time.
Our guest is Steve Weidenkopf. We're talking about his new book, The Church and the Middle Ages, Cathedrals, Crusades, and the Papacy in Exile. All right, we've hit 2 of them so far. But before we get to the exiled Pope, we got to talk St. Francis, because you put right in our face, you're like, okay, you be the judge. Did he really love animals and flowers all that much?
Yeah, exactly. Throughout the book, we have this little, sidebar, if you will, that's called, highlights or you be the judge in particular. And in that one, I talk about St. Francis because he usually is portrayed, with birds on his shoulder and preaching to animals and things like that, which, there are stories that he did that. And he did very much love and appreciate God's creatures. But sometimes I feel in the modern world we're a little bit too much focused on St. Francis as, this, more Christian flower child or something of the 60s, right? Where
a little softy.
He's a little soft. He's loving animals and this and that. But when you look at the actual history of St. Francis, right, everything he did was motivated by his love for Christ, his love for God, and he was focused on evangelization. And I think we miss that a lot, that what Francis really wanted his friars to do is to preach, to teach, to evangelize, to bring people to Christ. And he specifically wanted to do that towards Islam, really. He wanted to go into Muslim territory and preach the gospel there. He actually went and arrived at the Crusader camp during what was so-called the Fifth Crusade in Egypt, and went and preached the gospel to the Egyptian Sultan Al-Kamil at the time. So I think we don't always know that part of Francis's history. We don't always share it necessarily either. So instead of, I think, focusing on how much he loved God's creatures, which he did, we should also remember that he was very much an evangelist and wanted to spread the gospel.
So on October 4th, when people show up at the church with their hamsters and the poodles and the snakes, we say, don't forget, he was also evangelist.
Yes, absolutely.
Animals.
We will bless the pets, but he did a lot more than that. I mean, we're not going to turn you away. Maybe the giraffe. We don't want anything broken in here.
No. It's a both and, right? Bless the animals, but then preach the gospel too. Yeah, at the same time.
All right. Now I'm going to see, Steve, you're very good at this because you're a professor. So obviously you're talking all about history. History is thousands of years, and you got a class that's maybe an hour and a half long. So you know how to kind of squeeze it all in. But I'm going to see if we can now, in the next few minutes, before I have to say thanks for joining us, if we can figure out this whole thing where the Pope was in exile. It's actually, I would imagine, kind of a timely conversation because we right now live in a time where for the last few months there actually have been 2 people claiming legitimate authority over an area, a kingdom here in the United States. So what happened where we had was there 2 popes? Was there 3 popes? When they left Rome, did the guy just want to have a change of scenery? I prefer France. What happened with this whole Pope in exile thing?
Yeah, that's so, the whole point of whether there was more than one man claiming to be Pope and we had a couple of anti-popes, that actually happens after they get back from Avignon, from the south of France.
So they leave first.
But they leave
then
first.
That happens.
Then when they come back, then that's when everything just goes to hell.
So in other words, that's the next book.
That's exactly. That's in the next book.
All right. So why did they go to France?
So what happens is, at the beginning of the 14th century, you have the papacy of Boniface VIII. And Boniface VIII wanted to ensure the independence of the church and have it be free from secular interference, in particular from the French king, Philip IV, who had this really nasty habit of taking church money and church property and utilizing it to finance his own personal political things. Yeah, you shouldn't do that, right? What belongs to the church should go to the church, right? So, In some, yeah, it did, yeah. So he, he took this money, and Boniface VIII was upset with that. So he and Boniface have this really contentious relationship. So when Boniface dies, Philip IV wants to ensure that the next pope is a little more friendly to what he wants to do. And so the cardinals actually oblige, and they elect a Frenchman who takes the name Clement V. And he, again, is from France. He's the Archbishop of Bordeaux. He's not living in Rome. Yep, the wine area. He's not living in Italy. He doesn't want to go to Rome. He wants to stay in France. So he decides, I'll just move to Avignon. I'll move the papal residence to Avignon. Now, why Avignon? Avignon's in the south of France. It wasn't actually royal territory at the time. It was papal territory. So just as the Pope had the papal states or a territory that he was the lord of in Italy, there were also other areas throughout Christendom, including Avignon, that belonged to him. They were actually his territory, his property.
So it might be, just to use a modern day analogy that might help people, like the Queen of England, it would be like Australia or Canada. Well, let's have the Queen live in Australia, kind of like that.
Exactly. It was like that. Exactly. Yeah. And so he decides to leave, stays in France, moves down to Avignon. And initially it was seen as a temporary move. There was a lot of civil strife and conflict in Rome and among Italian families at the time. The French popes in particular, didn't feel safe in Rome. And so it was meant to be just a temporary relocation until things got better and a little more accommodating in Rome. But it turned out the temporary move turned out to be a 70-year absence. So they lived for nearly a century in the south of Rome. And you had a series of French popes. Now, the problem there is
the south of France.
South of France, yes.
Yeah.
And so the problem is that you have a lot of secular rulers then who begin to think and see that the Pope is nothing more than the puppet of the French king. He's living in France. Obviously, he's always going to side with the French king. Now, most popes in Avignon didn't pursue those kinds of policies, but it produced this resentment and this lack of respect and loss of respect, rather, for the Pope throughout Christendom. And that causes later on, in later centuries, even more problems.
Well, so presumably, though, this one Clement V, he's French. He's like, I'd rather stay in France. But after that, after Clement dies, they elect a new Pope, and the next guy says, oh, well, I was supposed to live in Avignon. I guess that's the way we've always done it.
Yeah, right. So, they were all French, right? So they don't want to move. I mean,
they're all French. They're
all French. Yeah, all these popes are French. Yeah, and they decide, well, Rome's humid and hot in the summertime. Why do we want to go there? No air conditioning yet. Definitely don't want to move back. Yeah.
Now, when you were first talking about Clement when he got elected, the reason why he wanted to rather have the papal residence in France, I thought it was going to be because of Abbot Suger, because he makes all the donuts and the delicious crullers. And
they go well together.
But no, it turns out it was different reasons. All right. So, Steve Weidenkopf, I think we got to leave people with a little cliffhanger here. What happens next? Oh, well, we'll have to have Steve back. We'll have to have the next book.
Exactly. Yeah, they move back to Rome, and you have to figure out.
He's going to tell us.
No. Just a little teaser.
Okay,
I mean, I guess that's not much of a spoiler alert for people.
No. Yeah, because
they move
there
back
now,
to Rome.
Right? Yeah,
he's there now.
We kind of know that part.
Yeah, he's there now. Yeah, they move back to Rome, and then all kinds of crazy things happen.
Oh, I like that. I like that as a it's like that's next time.
The next book. There's a lot of books after that. That's what you want to call it. Yeah.
That's true.
Now, Steve, you know that our producer Christina loves when you come on the show. She loves the history of the church for sure. But Christina, now that we can see Steve on Zoom, I'm betting you're even more impressed. He did not look at a single note or his laptop or any of the books on his shelf. It's all just in there his head.
Like a machine.
That's right. That's right. I'm just a font of interesting factoids of church history.
It's always very interesting. I'm always like, can we have Steve back yet?
Yeah,
I love history. I don't retain as much information in my brain as you do, though. I'll probably forget all of this in about 10 minutes.
Weidenkopf, like wise head in German?
Yeah, well, Kopf is definitely head. Weiden is actually can mean two different things. It can mean pastor or shepherd of a meadow, frankly. So Weiden can be a meadow, but it's also a small little white flower on the trees that grow along the Rhine River.
Wow.
So it could be flowerhead or meadowhead.
Yeah. Steve Weidenkopf, thank you so much. And we've got a link on our radio blog to where you can find out where you can pick up The Church and the Middle Ages, Cathedrals, Crusades, and the Papacy in Exile, cliffhanger. By the time you get to the end of the book, he will have written the next one. So don't worry about it. You're not going to be like starved for info for too long. It's great to see you. We hope to see you again soon.
Yeah, thanks, Father, Christine, everybody. I appreciate you having me on the show.
All right, keep it here on the Catholic Channel, Sirius XM 129.